All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are strapping in for a totally high octane ride through the lives of history's most unbelievably rugged figures. We're talking about the men and women who seemingly defied death, laughed right in the face of absolute disaster, and practically redefined what it means to be human. These aren't just your standard historical footnotes. These are people who completely blurred the line between flesh and blood mortals and literal unkillable legends.
Okay, let's dive into this. 634. Now, that's not a batting average or some arcade high score. That massive number represents the staggering, documented amount of assassination attempts that the former Cuban leader Fidel Castro actually survived over his lifetime. And according to Cuban intelligence, we aren't just talking about your standard run-of-the-mill espionage here. We're talking about everything from elaborate sniper plots and poisoned cigars to literally planting exploding seashells right where he liked to scuba dive. No way, right? But honestly, none of it worked.
He actually leaned right into this untouchable reputation, too. He once joked, "If surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic sport, I'd win gold." You kind of have to admit, that perfectly captures the unapologetic, totally badass tone of these historical figures who just scoffed at their own mortality. They survived the absolute impossible, and they knew it. But that begs a pretty fascinating question, doesn't it? Who else in history possessed this kind of legendary, unkillable stamina? Let's pivot away from modern espionage for a second and head into the legends of the physical ring. Because long before modern sports were even a thing, some of history's most famously intellectual figures were actually shockingly tough, absolute brawlers. Take the 16th U.S. president, for example. Abraham Lincoln stood a massive 6 feet 4 inches tall. Long before he was delivering the Gettysburg Address, this guy was a fearsome county wrestling champion. He fought in over 300 matches, and out of all of those, he only lost one. Just one. He used this fierce, no-holds-barred grappling style known as catch-as-catch-can. In fact, his dominance in the ring was so legendary that back in 1992, he was officially inducted into the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. And get this. He isn't the only brilliant mind with a devastating physical record. The irony of combining muscles and metaphysics is just incredible here. Did you know Plato wasn't even his real name? Actually, he was born Aristocles, but his wrestling coach gave him the nickname Plato, which literally translates to broad-shouldered. So before he was laying down the groundwork for Western philosophy, Plato was a fiercely competitive wrestler, throwing down in the ancient Isthmian games. And this brilliantly illustrates that incredible blend of grit and wit. But hey, if you want the ultimate example of defying mortality with a deeply morbid sense of humor, look no further than St. Lawrence. Back in ancient Rome, he was literally being grilled alive over an open fire by Roman officials. And his unbelievable final words? "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." I mean, wow. The backstory here is just as defiant. When those Roman officials demanded he surrender the church's treasures, he totally flipped the script. He brought them Rome's poor and sick instead, declaring them the true wealth of the church. Because of his unyielding spirit, his sharp wit, and that absolutely legendary barbecue one-liner, he earned two highly ironic titles. Today, he is officially remembered as the patron saint of both chefs and comedians. So we've seen survival, and we've seen defiance. But how did history's greatest conquerors handle their own mortal limitations? Let's talk about hubris for a second. There's a really fascinating contrast in history between terrifying reputations that were painstakingly crafted and the utterly absurd realities that eventually caught up with them. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer difference in actual power versus perceived power. On one hand, we have Blackbeard. We don't even know his real last name. Maybe Teach, maybe Thatch. He carefully cultivated this demonic image, literally weaving slow-burning fuses into his massive beard so he looked like a mortal emerging straight from hell. But on the other hand, we have Qing Shi. She didn't need any parlor tricks. She was the pirate queen of the South China Sea, commanding a mind-blowing fleet of 1,200 ships and 70,000 pirates. She was vastly more powerful than Blackbeard ever was. And when she finally stepped down, she negotiated full pardons, kept all her loot, and retired rich, respected, and totally undefeated. Now, contrast that supreme, calculated control with one of the greatest military minds in history facing, well, total absurdity. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte organized this massive, celebratory rabbit hunt. Thousands of bunnies were released into a field. But instead of fleeing from the great conqueror, the rabbits actually charged at him. Why? Because they were tame bunnies raised by farmers, and they just thought Napoleon was there to feed them. So the man who conquered Europe literally had to beat a hasty retreat, entirely overrun by a fuzzy stampede. You can't make this stuff up. Hubris, however, isn't always met with something as lighthearted as a rabbit stampede. Let's look at the ancient religious texts detailing the Calm-e-Odd. Around 2000 BC, this civilization was said to consist of literal physical giants, the strongest, most robust men in the world. They possessed incredible wealth and built the magnificent city of Iram, which is famously described as having 30 towering pillars, a total architectural marvel for its time. But their ruler, King Shaddad, was so consumed by his own power that he spent 300 years attempting to build a fake earthly paradise to rival heaven itself. And the texts record that their arrogance was their undoing. Right as King Shaddad arrived to view his completed paradise, the entire civilization was wiped out by a punishing black sandstorm. It raged relentlessly for 7 nights and 8 days, burying their invincible empire alive. Let's move to and see how this builds to our ultimate climax. We've talked about figures who defied death all throughout history, but honestly, no one in the 20th century embodied this exact phrase, more myth than mortal, quite like our next subject. Part 1, Hemingway's 24-hour nightmare. Okay, get ready, because the true story of Ernest Hemingway in 1954 is going to absolutely leave you speechless. We are talking about a 24-hour sequence of sheer, action-packed survival that pushes the very limits of human endurance. Here's the setup. Hemingway is on a sightseeing flight over the remote wilderness of Uganda. Suddenly, the plane goes down, crashing brutally right into the brush. Against all odds, he survives the wreckage and spends a terrifying night out in the jungle. The very next day, a rescue plane finally arrives. Hemingway boards it, battered but alive. But as the rescue plane accelerates down the runway for takeoff, disaster strikes again. The plane crashes and bursts into a massive fireball. That's 2 plane crashes in the remote African wilderness in less than 24 hours. And to put the sheer physical toll this took on his body into perspective, 9. That is the number of severe concussions Hemingway sustained from the violent explosive force of those impacts. 9. Most people wouldn't survive 1 crash of that magnitude, let alone 2 of them back to back, all while enduring immense cranial trauma. So the crucial point is how he actually escaped that burning second aircraft. Trapped inside the flaming fuselage, bleeding, suffering from 9 concussions, and with the cabin door jammed completely shut, Hemingway didn't just sit there and wait to die. Fueled by pure primal adrenaline, he threw his own battered body at the exit and literally headbutted the jam door open, breaking free of the wreckage just in the nick of time. It is a raw, cinematic climax to a story that proves the man was virtually indestructible. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. If history is written by the survivors, what does it truly take to cross the line from a fragile mortal to an unkillable myth? Is it dodging 634 bullets like Castro? Is it the towering physical dominance of Lincoln? Or is it the sheer explosive willpower of Hemingway literally headbutting his way out of a burning plane? It just goes to show that the human spirit and the human body are capable of far, far more than we can possibly imagine. Keep questioning the history you know, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.